Hey folks, Nick here from Another BookTube channel, and today I'm talking about my favorite horror movies. Obviously, this is a book channel first and foremost, but I love movies and I love horror, and it's Halloween, so why not? I just felt like talking about this a little bit, and it occurred to me while I was putting this list together that I've never actually done a list of in my personal life of my personal favorite horror movies. I've seen so many, and there are ones that I recommend, and I have different recommendations for different moods, different people, like depending on what you look for. Um, but I've never really sat and thought about if I had to choose 10 as my personal favorites, what would they be? So this was kind of a fun exercise, a little interesting. A couple disclaimers up front. These are not the 10 best horror movies I've ever seen. In my opinion, I've seen better horror movies than these, probably, for some of them. But these are my favorite ones, meaning, I love David Cronenberg's The Fly is a great horror movie. Absolutely terrific. But I haven't really I don't go back to that one, it's not a favorite that I've connected with, and I will just sit and watch. I think I've only seen it once. So these are horror movies that specifically I've revisited, and I want to still revisit more, because I have some kind of personal real attachment to them. So that's what I mean by favorite. So don't get too upset if you don't see your favorite horror movie up here, or if something that is objectively brilliant, The Witch, The Vivitch, it's not on here. It's just my personal favorites. Also, just a quick note that I'm not including on this list either Stuart Gordon's Reanimator or John Carpenter's The Thing. And the only reason for that is because I have done a video like this in the past where I talked about my favorite sci-fi movies, and both of those appeared on that list, and I don't want to take up another 2 spots on this list using the same movies. But realistically, both of those would be on my favorite horror movie list, and pretty high up there, to be honest. I'm also gonna just include here a couple runners-up that almost made the cut. Little Shop of Horrors, specifically the Rick Moranis one from the 80s. I absolutely adore that movie. I love it. It's my favorite musical. I love Rick Moranis. I love the puppetry. Everything about that movie is just a delight. I kept it off here because it is, to me, more of a musical comedy than horror, actually. So I wanted to try to keep things more specifically spooky or scary. Another runner-up is Cabin in the Woods by Drew Goddard and Joss Whedon. I had this on the list initially. I took it off because I haven't watched it in a few years, and I don't know. I do still think it's terrific, but when I really do some soul searching and think about my favorites, I don't know. Is it really one of my favorites, in the top 10? I don't know. So just throwing that out there. And now we'll just get into it. So these are my top 10 favorite horror movies in no particular order. I didn't feel like doing that. You're probably not going to hear anything here that isn't a well-known movie. Maybe one, is kind of random, but the rest of these you've probably heard of. So this is just going to be a conversation where you can tell me that you agree or disagree. But don't expect to get some hidden gems or sleeper cells here. The first I'll talk about is Saw, and I actually debated putting this on here. I debated putting this or Saw 2. They're both kind of even for me, and I debated putting either on here because, again, I haven't watched a Saw movie. Well, actually, I haven't watched one of the original Saw movies in a really long time. I watched that Chris Rock one somewhat recently, and I didn't really care for it much at all. The reason I feel like I have to put it on here is because Saw was really important to me for a long time. When I was in high school, I was obsessed with the Saw movies. from Saws 1 through 6, I think. Whichever one, I stopped paying attention, like what the one that had Chester Bennington from Linkin Park in it. Like that was where I kind of hopped off. But yeah, there was a good 6 year stretch in the middle of my formative years where I was truly obsessed with Saw. When I mean obsessed, I mean I knew the names of every trap. I knew the names of all the characters in the trap and their transgressions. I had the chronology of Jigsaw's life like figured out in my mind. I was like a total stan. I was an encyclopedic knowledge of Saw, and I'm not anymore. I've forgotten much of it. I've moved on to better things, but it was still they were really important to me. And that first Saw movie, even though I haven't watched it in a while, I think it would still really like hit me just like how much I enjoyed it. And I love Saw 2 as well. I think that that's a really polished and fun movie that expands on the idea of the Jigsaw Killer in a fun, interesting way that doesn't just exactly repeat the first movie. So yeah, I saw two, kind of both. Um, Next up is The Exorcist 3, and this is a really good example for illustrative purposes of how this is a personal my favorites list and not a best of list, because The Exorcist 1 is objectively amazing. It is one of the best horror movies ever made, and honestly it should be on my favorites list as well. I just didn't want to include multiples from the same franchise here. Plus, you already know about The Exorcist. You've seen The Exorcist. You've seen horror movies. If you like horror movies, you've seen The Exorcist. But there are a lot of people, horror fans included, who have not watched Exorcist 3 because they assume it sucks. Because that's usually a pretty good bet, for horror sequels. And Exorcist 2, The Heretic, is truly one of the worst movies I've ever seen in my life. But Exorcist 3, I'm here to tell you, you got to be watching Exorcist 3. It is so good. It is so great. It is a flawed movie for sure. There was a lot of studio interference. William Peter Blatty directed it himself, and there was some contention between how much of the movie should actually include exorcisms or not, because for William Peter Blatty, basing it on his novel Legion, there was no exorcisms in that, but the studio was like, it's an Exorcist movie. It's got to be called The Exorcist. You got to have an exorcism in there. So the final product is a little jumbled, admittedly, but it is still a really fun, kind of nightmarish, dreamlike movie full of excellent performances. It also features one of my favorite on-screen friendships that I've ever seen in a movie between Kinderman and Father Dyer. There's like the first 20 minutes, half hour of the movie is just those two old men just sparring with each other verbally, these old friends. And it's so funny and they're so likable. And then like something devastating happens and it hurts so much. It's truly excellent. It is an excellent movie. Watch it. And I only recently got to see the original cut because I got the Blu-ray that has the theatrical cut and the director's cut. The director's cut includes the original ending plus more scenes with Brad Dourif. Brad Dourif's in this movie. Brad Dourif is great in everything he's ever been in, so that is alone a reason to see it. I think my ideal Exorcist 3 is a combination of the two, because I like the original intended ending more than the kind of studio enforced ending. Next up, Alien, the original Alien by Ridley Scott. This is one. I mean, this is one that again you know about it. This is a horror movie set in space, and it is still to this day one that succeeds at pretty much every level. It is a claustrophobic nightmare. The design of the xenomorph is so perfect. H.R. Giger delivered just absolutely one of the best designed creatures ever in movie history, and it was executed flawlessly. It is a movie that I have gone back to a number of times. It's one that I've ingested in multiple formats. The graphic novel adaptation by Walt Simonson is also great. The novelization by Alan Dean Foster is also great. The comics from Dark Horse Comics were great in the beginning. Like it is a great franchise. I love those first two movies. Second one's more of an action movie, but that first Alien, yeah, I mean, I can't. There's not a lot I could say about it that you haven't heard. I think it's fantastic. And the next movie, kind of similar, Jaws. Jaws is as good as advertised. Still, even from being from 1975, being a just a pretty by today's standards standard shark movie. Like there's just one shark that's terrorizing this little island. There's no, it's not the Meg. There's not megalodons on the loose that are knocking, yachts out of the water and breaching holes and all that. It's just the one little big great white shark. But there is so much terror that is pulled out of this scenario. It is Steven Spielberg at his finest. I think it's maybe my favorite Steven Spielberg movie as well. Um, and there's so much in it that still inspires a great deal of fear. I mean, it's a cliche that like people are still afraid to go in the water. People are still afraid of sharks because of Jaws, and it's been 40 years, 50 years at this point. Like that's how effective it is, and it completely deserves its reputation. My favorite moment in it is the one of the beach scene where the little boy is eaten by the shark, and you could only see it kind of like in the distance through the other swimmers, like from afar. You just see this big thing come out of the water, and it just rolls over the boy, and just the water becomes all red around that little spot in the ocean. It's terrifying. So good. So yeah, Jaws is lit. I mean, if you didn't know. All right. This movie is the only one on this list that maybe you haven't heard of because it's a little bit obscure. But it's one that I really enjoy, and I haven't seen it for a while, but I want to see it again. It's really good. Summer of '84. This was a kids on bikes movie that came out a little bit after Stranger Things started. We got kind of inundated with kids on bikes '80s pastiche movies. So this one may have gotten kind of shuffled in that mix, and unrightly so, because it is. I think it stands above that crowd of stuff that came out around that time. It is a really tight, fun movie that is genuinely like disturbing at the end. It is a kids on bikes movie where kids in the neighborhood. One of them thinks that his neighbor is a serial killer. Pretty standard kind of sounding plot. They investigate. They look for clues into whether he's actually guilty or not. And all I'll say is just that the ending goes in a direction that I really didn't expect the first time I watched it. And when I watched it a second time with my partner, I basically just watched her while the movie was playing because I wanted to see her reaction to the ending as well. And it was as satisfying as I wanted it to be. So that's a really great movie. I can't remember the filmmakers' names, but Summer of '84, awesome. Back to the classics here, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the original by Tobe Hooper. Of the original, like big horror franchises, slasher franchises, whatever if you want to classify this as such, like Halloween, Nightmare on Elm Street, Friday the 13th, Texas Chainsaw. I think if we're looking at first movies, Texas Chainsaw Massacre to me is hands down the best first movie of all four of those franchises. Unfortunately, the rest of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre franchise is god awful. But none of the other movies I think surpasses how much I enjoy Texas Chainsaw Massacre. It is a raw filmmaking that still is extremely powerful because of how raw it is. It feels dirty. It feels like you are in danger. It feels like the film was rescued from the house of these savages. Leatherface is a genuinely iconic character, and deservedly so. It features some of the most iconic imagery of all time, one of the most iconic endings of all time. It is another one that is as good as advertised, and I love it. I've seen it many times, and I still love it. All right, next is this one might be a little bit of recency bias, but just genuinely I love this movie, and I talked about it kind of recently on this channel because I reviewed the novelization of it, and that is X by Ty West. I know the common consensus is that Pearl is the better movie. People like that one a lot more. I like Pearl a lot. I don't like it more than X. Pearl is a weird movie. Pearl is not even a horror movie. It's just like a strange character study. X is a horror movie. It is a great take on the slasher genre, and it does something that no other slasher that I've ever seen has ever done. It made me feel something. It made me feel and think about something other than just wanting to see more blood and cool kills. X is an excellent movie, no pun intended, about the aging, the fear of getting old, the fear of not leaving your mark on the world, and the reconciling of being old and wanting to still be young and still have those feelings of having worth, having something to contribute, something to do, to act as a young person would. Um, I think it's a wonderful, beautiful movie for that, despite how sick it is. It is a borderline pornographic movie because it is literally about filming a pornographic film, and it's very bloody. But like, there's a scene where Brittany Snow sings "Landslide" by Fleetwood Mac while Kid Cudi plays acoustic guitar. And maybe it's cheating because you could put that song in anything and it'll make me want to cry. But like, I wanted to cry at that scene. Like, it was so like lovely. And it's inside this movie that is so freaky and scary and weird and like goes places that will like shock you. It's awesome. I really loved it. The novelization was great too. And while I'm on this note, I want to talk briefly about The Substance, which is this new movie that has gone viral and people are loving it. I hated The Substance. I could do like a separate video about all the reasons why I hated The Substance, but one of the things was that The Substance is another movie about the fear of aging. I think it does that idea much worse than X. I think that The Substance has one thing to say about like Hollywood hates old women, it prefers young women. And then it just says that over and over again for 2.5 hours. And it's like, okay, we got it. We got it in the first 10 minutes. And there was nothing subtle about it. There was no subtext. It was just what the movie was about. And X has a lot of subtext. X you got to think a little bit about. And that's what I like. I like to have to think just a little bit to do some of the work for myself. Unlike The Substance, which is just like, did you get it? Did you get it? Nah, whatever. I'm not going to talk anymore about The Substance. Moving on. What do we got? We got 3 left to talk about. I had to put a David Lynch movie on here. I know when it comes to horror, David Lynch might not be like the first name thought of, but his movies are often terrifying. And I think his most terrifying is Twin Peaks: Fire Walk with Me. Admittedly, a couple things to admit actually with this one. You do kind of have to see the show Twin Peaks to fully appreciate this one. If you watch this without watching the show first, which you do have to, even though this is a prequel to the show, you have to watch the show first. You must. The movie hits better with the show as context. Also, another admission, I didn't like this movie when I first saw it. I thought I didn't know what to think of it. It was too different from the show. It was too weird. I found it like dense and kind of needlessly off-putting. But I took some time away from it and revisited it after some time, after hearing other opinions. My partner loved it the first time she saw it, and she was vocal to me about why. And then I watched it again with her notes in mind, and like I got it finally, and it is actually an amazing movie. It is this one is actually very nightmarish. It feels very unreal. It is about just the dissolution and the decay of this young teenage girl's life as she's enduring horrible trauma at the hands of, spoiler redacted. Um, yeah, it is absolutely sensational. It is a great movie about trauma, and it can be a tough watch for people who are like triggered by stuff like that. But it captures that feeling so well by being unrealistic in a lot of ways, by creating these environments and these characters and these scenarios that are otherworldly, and just outside of the realm of realism. It's a brilliant movie, really fantastic. Um, Second movie left, or the second to last movie that I'll talk about, is The Evil Dead 2, Dead by Dawn, often called Dead by Dawn, sometimes called Dead by Dawn. I really like the Evil Dead franchise in general. Those first two movies are my favorites. I like Evil Dead 2 because it is a great expansion of the idea from the first movie, which was more of a straightforward horror movie. And then the second one, they said, now let's do a funny one. Like let's get silly with it. It's really over the top with its blood. The visual gags, though, are so smart, so clever. And Bruce Campbell is absolutely perfect. I love Bruce Campbell. His incredible physicality, his willingness to just throw his body into the comedic situations and just throw himself all around the room. Unmatched. It's such a wonderfully fun performance. That also, I mean, the movie still features a lot of great, splatter effects. It's not really a scary movie, but it is definitely a horror movie. Not a lot of people, not everybody would be able to, sit and watch it because of just how bloody it was. But well, nowadays the Terrifier movies are really hot. So if people are making that the number one movie at the box office, then Evil Dead 2 probably it's going to seem pretty quaint to them now. For the record, I'm not a fan of the Terrifier movies. They don't really do anything for me. So yeah, I love Evil Dead 2. Also really love Evil Dead 1. Army of Darkness, I'm like, I'm mixed on. It depends on my mood. Army of Darkness is much more of just a fantasy adventure movie. It's got some incredible effects in it. The stop motion, like Ray Harryhausen homage, stuff is great. Admittedly, there's a lot of fun classic lines from it. But just in terms of like contextualizing it against Evil Dead 2, Evil Dead 2 is more of what I personally want. But Army of Darkness is good too. And the last movie I'll talk about, and this is maybe my top of all time, this is Stanley Kubrick's The Shining. This is one of my most nostalgic movies. It is one of the first real movies I ever remember watching as a child. It's the one that kind of awakened in me this idea that movies were an art form, that like cinema was an actual thing. And it wasn't just, life wasn't just Space Jam, although Space Jam is great. And maybe we could use more Space Jam, but not Space Jam 2. That movie was awful. I've gone off on a tangent. The Shining. The Shining is excellent. The Shining is one of my favorite movies. In general, I got to see it in a theater a couple years ago, which was a wonderful experience. I know that there are Stephen King purists out there. I love Stephen King too. I love the original Shining book. Those people might say that the movie changes way too much. It's not really The Shining. I don't care. Stanley Kubrick had his own story to tell, and he told it, and he told the shit out of it. It's such a good movie. It is the definition of slow burn done well. There's so much. It's a long movie, and there's so much that doesn't happen for a long stretch of time, but just that mounting dread, that sense of like the environment is closing in on you. You are in a dangerous place. Things are becoming more dangerous the longer you are here. It is brilliant. It is perfect. I love it. I love it. Jack Nicholson's great. Shelley Duvall's great. Um, Talk about iconic images, man. So much. The bloody elevator, the riding the tricycle around, the twin girls. Like, there's so much in The Shining that you've seen parodied elsewhere and never surpassed. So I just love The Shining, and that's that. Those are my 10 favorite horror movies of all time. Let me know what you think of that list. Let me know what your favorites are, and I'll let you know in the comments if I've seen them and what I thought of them, or maybe why it didn't make my list. Again, there's a lot of movies that I've seen that are better than these in some cases, but they're not necessarily my favorites. So keep that in mind. Thank you very much for spending some time with me today. But now it's time to get back to reading.